So I want to start by talking about how generosity flexes a different muscle than the tithe. Okay, so if you are familiar with the Bible at all throughout the Old Testament, there's this concept of the tithe. It's a tenth. It's the first fruits. So in an agrarian society, let's say you were growing apples. The Lord said to you, give me your first yield, your first 10%. Bring that to the temple, and they would take that and give it to the temple. That was their tithe. And then, honestly, the priests would eat. They would consume. That was how the priests would live, is they would live off of the tithes of the nation. The priests did not own land themselves, but instead they received from the body of Israel. Then we see that continue on into the New Testament, where Paul talks about the tithe. He talks about how we're not supposed to muzzle the ox, and that there's support for the local church. And so those tithes continue to kind of fund and fuel the work and the rhythm. It's an obedience thing. It's different than generosity. Generosity comes from the category of offerings. So in addition to the tithe, God would invite moments of opportunity where Israel or the church in the New Testament would bring their offerings. And it was sometimes called a free will offering. It was above and beyond the tithe. It was given as an act of celebration, gratitude, worship, abundance. These offerings were given because the nation had to give, God called on it, or there was a specific invitation, a specific moment. Here's just an example. I spent last year talking about this, so I'll kind of be short with it, but God could meet any need. We know that. So like an example of that is when Israel was enslaved in Egypt and God wanted his people out of Egypt, he didn't go to Pharaoh and say, how much is it going to cost to buy my people out of slavery? I want them, I will send you the money, via PayPal, whatever. I'm going to get you your money and you release my people. And that's not the exchange. Instead, God demonstrated his power. He sent the plagues. Eventually, Pharaoh let the people go. They went through the Red Sea on dry ground, and the sea closed up on the army of Egypt that was chasing Israel. That was a miraculous provision of God. He didn't use the possessions of the people, but there are other times, like, for example, when God wanted to build the temple. He didn't start to swirl the dust of the ground and kind of make, sapphires and gold and silver and timber and linens and whip it up into a temple that could be used to house his presence. He called on his people. He said, bring me your timber, bring me your linen, bring me your gold and your silver and your rubies and your sapphires, bring me your possessions. And then he gave instructions on how they were to use their craftsmanship to build up this temple. It was different. Okay, similarly in the New Testament, Jesus is preaching to thousands of people and they're getting hungry, and the disciples are like, should we send everybody home to go eat? And Jesus says, well, why don't we feed them? And they're like, there's no money for that. We can't afford to feed all of these thousands of people. And so Jesus essentially says, well, what do we have? And this kid's lunch is presented. And Jesus takes the bread and the fish, and he breaks the bread and he blesses it, and they start handing it out to the crowd. Thousands of people from one lunch. It's miraculously multiplied to where everybody ate until they were full, and there were baskets upon baskets left over. That is miraculous provision from God to answer a real physical human need like hunger. And then there are other times where there are specific needs. In the early church, for example, there were some that had need, others had abundance. They brought their goods together in Acts chapter 2 and in Acts chapter 4. They brought what they possessed together and started to distribute it out to widows, to the poor, to those that were in need. Everybody got what they needed. Those that had extra gave, and those that needed took, and the community was able to be satisfied together. Their needs were met together. It's an incredible moment where God used the physical resources of his people to meet a specific need. That's the category of generosity. When God calls on us to give beyond our tithe, beyond the rhythm and obedience of giving that we do on a regular basis, when God calls on us to give, he's calling on a different heart. He's calling on a heart of, we use the word, generosity. So there are a couple examples of this, even in the New Testament, where Paul will actually call on churches to give money because there's a famine in Jerusalem. So they don't have food in Jerusalem, and Paul's going church to church doing a rally to get enough money to take to the believers in Jerusalem so that they can eat. This is one of those moments where it's a famine in Jerusalem. What's the solution to a famine? Rain. Who's controlling the rain? God. You don't need to answer the questions. I'll answer them for you. All right. It very easily could have been God that to resolve the famine in Jerusalem sends rain and provides for them and answers the issues. But instead of doing that, God calls on the local churches that are now being planted all around the Mediterranean to rally money to send with Paul to go and bless the believers in Jerusalem. It's an incredible moment. There's another one where Paul's planting churches. He's doing ministry and going to different places, and he calls on the Philippian church to help him financially to go into Thessalonica. Now, one of the big things with church planting, Paul wanted to go in, and it can be awkward if you're trying to preach the gospel, and then you're like, hey, also, could you support us financially? Because we just need to be here and we need to eat. So we will preach to you and you feed us. It's a great relationship. Let's go for it. That can be hard to walk into that. So instead, Paul would try and create avenues that allowed him to minister without a burden. He tells the Thessalonians that we work night and day so as not to be a burden to you. And so he had two income streams in Thessalonica. He worked as a tent maker, and the Philippian church sent him money, and he was able to minister and connect with those people. So there's ways that God does this work. He invites his people to give to meet a specific need, and it's an incredible opportunity that we have. So today we're going to look at that generosity side. What happens when we're generous? When we give money, what is the impact that comes from that? So 5 big things. The first one is this. Our needs are met, or their needs are met. Paul writes this in Philippians 4:18, and you can open up to Philippians. That's where a lot of where we'll be is. That's a weird sentence. This is mostly where we're going to spend our time today, is in the book of Philippians. Chapter 4, verse 18, Paul writes to the Philippians, and he says this. He says, I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied. Now, if I were to stop there, you might think that he's talking about his spiritual needs. Guys, God's grace upon grace has been lavished on me. I'm full of gratitude, full of encouragement. I feel so blessed. Those are things that Paul could say if it was a spiritual need that was being met. But he finishes the sentence by saying, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. Paul received a financial gift from the Philippian church via Epaphroditus, who was the messenger that brought it. Okay, he physically got money from the Philippian church and took it to Paul and gave it to him so Paul could do the work that he was doing. Now, the reason that Paul needed money is because it costs money to do the work that Paul was doing. A lot of scholars have looked at Paul's missionary journeys, and just to try and put it in a modern day monetary value, to give us an idea, what does it cost to do ministry? And the average cost that they've come up with is about $280,000 in today's money is what it would cost Paul to do what he did, to travel around the Mediterranean, to go to different places, stay in different places, eat the food, buy new sandals. All of the physical things that it took to do the ministry that he did was roughly $280,000. And that money came from somewhere. It came from Antioch, it came from Philippi, it came from tent making. Paul would work. Aquila and Priscilla would work. Came from a lot of other churches that they would eventually connect with to do different work and different ministry in different places. But that's a lot of actual money that it takes. It actually costs money. When it says that Paul sailed from Miletus to Cyprus, it wasn't like they just had a free boat system that you could just hop on any boat and get to the next best island that you want to go to. Everybody's going to Mykonos all of a sudden for free. That's not how it worked. You actually had to pay for transport. And you would get on these boats and you would pay to be a part of it, or you would work as a crew on that boat in order to get from point A to point B. So every time Paul gets on a boat, every time he stays in a town, unless there were believers in the town and they could stay with him, like Paul with Philip when he gets back to Caesarea. There are times that they would stay with other believers, and there's times where, as far as we know, they were paying for lodging. $280,000. Physical needs are met. So it's been a joy over the years for us as a church to give. We're now coming up, we believe this year we'll pass $2 million going out from us as a church over the last 15 years. That we've been able to just send money into different places. We've been able to pay salaries. We've been able to buy cars. We've been able to actually help either churches or ministries with their facilities, youth and family center, buying a building or renovating a church, whatever the case, we've been able to do a ton of physical work out in the world with the money that's gone forward. There's been a significant impact in needs being met as this money's gone out. This year, we talked about Kenneth and Chisholm. They're planting a church in Nigeria. Their video was on last week. If you weren't here last week, it's on our website, celebrategenerosity.com. I'd love for you to go and take a look. But Kenneth and Chisholm moved to Nigeria from Dubai. Kenneth had a great job in Dubai. It was a high-paying corporate job. They said he could work anywhere. And so he decided to move to his hometown of Lagos, Nigeria, to start a church and be paid by his corporation to live in his hometown. He would do work for them and plant a church. Then pretty quickly after they got there, his company called and said, hey, the job's in London. We need you to move to London. And he said, I'm not going to move to London. I'm here. And they said, well, there's no job here. The job's in London. And he said, then I'm going to stay here. So he went from his plan of being bivocational, meaning earning an income from one place while doing work there and simultaneously doing work for his ministry, for the church that they were planting, to being a full-time minister of the gospel with no income in one of the poorer cities in the world. So we get a chance to meet their physical needs, to help pay their salary, to help give them food, to help their church find a place to meet week in and week out. We get to actually meet those physical needs, and it's an absolute joy. These ministries that have been up here, they burn through capital. They spend money. And we would want nothing different from them. We want them doing the work that they're doing, spending this money in these ways. That's why we are with them. And the ones last week, they're on the front lines doing work in dark places, out there, and none of that stuff makes money. It all costs money, and so we get to be this backstop of support that invests and pours money into the work that's being done so that they can stay on those front lines doing the work that they're doing. That's how our generosity meets needs, is it puts money in these places and allows these people to continue working and ministering in each of those places. We live in a world with real economic circumstances, and occasionally God will circumvent. Sometimes he will do things out of a complete miracle and provide, and it still happens to this day, and we love those stories. But we also know that he calls on his people to be generous, and we want to say yes when he does. That's the first thing. Needs are met. The second one is that impact is multiplied. Impact is multiplied. A few weeks ago, I taught out of Acts chapter 16 about Paul and Philippi and Thessalonica. So I've shared a little bit of this story, but I'll share it again. So Paul was in Philippi. He had done ministry, and then a persecution arose, and he had to leave, and he was going to Thessalonica next. And as he was going there, Philippi supported him financially to go into Thessalonica, and he started to do work there. He was only there for 3 weeks before he got kicked out of Thessalonica. But in those 3 weeks, an incredible seed was planted, and this is what Paul writes to the Thessalonians. He says, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord. Okay, so the first thing is, they preached the gospel. Paul and his team preached the gospel to Thessalonica. The Thessalonians became imitators of that and started preaching the gospel. For you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. That's a huge region. Think most of Greece. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, that word of the Lord sounding forth, that's them preaching. They became preachers of the gospel. Not only are you preaching, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. So the Philippian money paid for Paul's ministry. Paul's ministry was multiplied in that the Thessalonians started preaching the gospel as well and living faithful lives, so that by the time that even Paul got to some of these other towns, like we didn't even need to say anything, Jesus was already there because of what you guys have done. He got to see the impact multiplied exponentially. 12 years ago, I took Jeremy to Thailand, and we went to Zoe International, to their facility in Thailand. It was an incredible opportunity. We went with Evan and Shannon and Brooklyn Regenstrife and just got to go and visit and see what God was doing in that place. And part of that trip, we got to go see their actual facility outside of Chiang Mai, which was beautiful and incredible to see the work that they're doing there. But there's this other element to what they do, where some of these kids that are trafficked, in fact, many of the kids that are trafficked and rescued come to faith in Jesus. And many of the ones that come to faith in Jesus have a desire to become preachers of the gospel. When you're rescued out of darkness, you want to proclaim the marvelous light. And so Zoe has a Bible school, and they train up young men and women to be preachers of the gospel. Some of them are trafficked. Some of them are people that hear about the Bible school that weren't trafficked but want to come and be trained, and they come into Zoe's property, and they have a 2-year Bible program, and part of that program is that they go out to the rural areas and they go evangelize in places that have never heard the gospel. So Jeremy and I got to go with a team out to one of these rural villages, and we would just go hut to hut. And I say hut to hut because we would actually go in, they would invite us into their home, and this one family in particular invited us into their home, and their entire home was probably the size of my daughter's bedroom. Their family room was their bedroom, was their kitchen, was their bathroom was outside. That's it. They had a fire going in the middle of their hut where they could cook, and it would also keep them warm. It was an incredible scene, and we're there, and I remember this. They invited me to sit on their bed, and they sat on the floor, and Jeremy was sitting on the floor, and this young man who had been a part of Zoe's Bible school, and if I'm being totally honest, I don't know if he was a young man that was trafficked or one that had come in from outside, but he had entered into the Bible school, and he was preaching the gospel to this family in their native tongue with joy in his eyes. And we got to witness. Honestly, Jeremy and I just sat there and watched. I got to see my son, who at the time I think he was 8 or 9 years old. I got to watch him watching a young Thai man share the gospel of Jesus in this rural community. And I got to see the mark that it made on Jeremy. So, I mean, we're sending money into Zoe. And we're meeting many of their needs in terms of the physical things that it costs to run an organization of that scope. It's massive. There's so much that they have going on. But the impact, it's not just the dollar spent, but that dollar has produced fruit upon fruit upon fruit upon fruit. That the money that we've given in the last 12 years that we've been supporting Zoe has seen such reach beyond anything we've ever given, that we get to rejoice in God's multiplication of his work. 12 years ago, there's one more short story about Impact Multiplied. 12 years ago, we gave money to Andy and Jackie Rogers, who were going to plant Restored Church in San Diego. So Andy and Jackie planted Restored Church, Normal Heights, uptown area of San Diego. It's a beautiful church. We love it dearly. And in the time since they planted there, they've planted churches into Northridge, Chula Vista, Temecula, Rancho Cucamonga. They've partnered with a church in Durban, South Africa, and they've sent teams into North Africa and India to do embedded gospel work. So we spent maybe $20,000 or $30,000 that we sent into Restored Church. And since then, we've gotten to see this multiplication of work, churches going out from them into communities that we have no reach into, but the gospel is being proclaimed, people are being discipled, and not the North Africa and India stories, because they're more on the receiving side, but those 5 churches all do their version of Celebrate Generosity. They call it Give Love. And they take a week of the year, and they take in their whole offering, and they give it entirely away. 5 churches doing this same thing. It's incredible to see the impact multiplied when we sow into what God is doing. The third thing, our lives are transformed. Paul writes this in Philippians 1:11. When he talks about the life of a person whose love abounds, and that love in the context of Philippians is generosity, he talks about that person being filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. Filled with the fruit of righteousness. When we give, when our love abounds, when our generosity abounds, we are filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes from Jesus Christ. Our lives are reshaped and molded. Last week, Bert talked about the passage where Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he pointed out that that's both diagnostic and instructive. So it's diagnostic in that you can look at that and say where your treasure is. And some of us might have to say, where's my treasure? We would look for our treasure, and then we'd say, okay, that's where my heart is. So the things that I value, that's what has my heart. That's what I am living for. So it's diagnostic. But it's also instructive. To the believer, Jesus is telling you, put your treasure in the things that matter because your heart will follow. Be intentional. Set what matters according to Jesus, and your heart will follow. And what we see is lives being transformed when God takes our hands and opens them up, and He challenges us to live differently. We start to do life in a different way. We live with a different kind of generosity. We live with a different kind of attitude and approach to people. We see people with different eyes. When Denise was here last week talking about Harbor House, that she knows every single one of the 400, and I think it was 12 unhoused people in our community. She spent time with them. She's looked into their eyes and built relationships with many of them. There was something that was done there to change our hearts. You could feel the feeling in the room shifted when she shared about our community and how many of those people that are currently without a home came through the foster care system. You could feel the hearts break in the room for people who are struggling. Not just somebody that makes our town dirtier or that gets in the way of us having a pleasant suburban life, but real lives that have been traumatized and affected and broken down. Our hearts are changed. When we're generous, our hearts are transformed. When we're generous, the gospel is preached. Now, if you've been with us when we've been talking about what to do about the building, you've heard me say this. We could do this in a dirt field. We could preach the gospel in a dirt field. We don't need these beautiful walls. We don't need this new carpet that Mike pointed out. It's about 8 years old now. But we don't need these things to function. We got you the extra cushy chairs so you could sit for a full 45-minute sermon. We don't need these things. But at the same time, many of the places that the gospel is going, there are those physical limitations. And when we give, the gospel is preached. Paul writes this in 1 Thessalonians 1, 4, and 5. For we know, brothers, loved by God, that He's chosen you, because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit and with full conviction. Paul said to the Philippians, even in Thessalonica, you sent me help once and again. The Philippian money gave Paul the freedom to preach the gospel. For 3 weeks, he preached the gospel to Thessalonica. And a church was planted whose faith sounded forth throughout all Macedonia and Achaia and beyond. When we give, you've heard it. Every single one of the people that's been up here has been proclaiming Jesus as Mike put it, the special sauce. When we give, we're seeing the gospel preached in different ways in different places that we have no reach into. And lastly, fifthly, God is glorified. Paul wrote to the Philippians and referred to their financial support as a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. Now that's Old Testament language. Paul's referring back to the sacrificial system where there were acceptable sacrifices when you gave the best of your flock, and there were unacceptable sacrifices when you would look at your flock and say, well, that one's got a broken leg, and you would bring that one to the temple and give what was left over. God would look at that and say, that's not the heart that I'm looking for. That's not the approach that I'm not looking for your leftovers. I'm not looking for your remnant. And it even got to the point where I believe it's Hosea, he tells Israel, stop. Stop with the tithes. Stop with the sacrifices. I want your heart. Paul's writing to the Philippian church, and he's saying, look, when you were generous with me, when your love abounded, this was a heart call and a heart response. When your love abounded and you gave, that offering was a fragrant aroma to the Lord. It was an acceptable offering to God. And this is what we're asking of you. I've said it 20 times in the last 3 weeks. This is not a fundraiser. As much as we're giving money to incredible places, this is not a fundraiser. Celebrate Generosity is actually about shaping our hearts to be a generous people. We think of generosity as a gateway. See, if you're going through life And particularly with money, and this is why today I'm talking about the financial side of it. If you're going through life with your hands gripped around what you possess, it is hard for us to open up our hands in worship. It's hard for us to open up our hands in prayer. It's hard for us to be people of service that say yes when an opportunity opens up to serve the Lord. When we go through life like this, it's actually hard for us to say yes to the things that God is asking of us. So Celebrate Generosity is designed to give God an intentional moment to peel our fingers away from the things that we're holding on to and to show us what it looks like to live our lives with our hands open and say yes to the opportunities that He's presenting. One of the great joys and gifts of having these ministries standing up here over the last 2 weeks is I get to point to them and say, look, 100% of what you give, like starting with the cans today or the online link, 100% of everything that comes in, starting today and all the way through next Saturday. Your regular online giving, we don't even care. It's going to Celebrate Generosity. You could accidentally Venmo us, and we're giving that to Celebrate Generosity. Like whatever you give, every dime that comes in for the next week, 100% of it goes to these initiatives. Everything. We are calling on you for more than just the recurring thing, more than just the accidental thing. We're calling you to pray about it, to open your hands up to the Lord and say, what would you have us to give? Because then it becomes a matter of the heart. We don't set a target amount of dollars because then it's like just a little bit more, and then it's me trying to turn the dials. And I don't want to turn the dials of money. That's not the job of a preacher. I'm not trying to get more money out of you. I want more of God's presence in you, and I want to see what that does. I want to see what happens when we open up our hands and say yes to God. That gets me excited. That's when we get to see the fruit of generosity, and that's when our church is truly transformed. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring our elder team up. We're going to take a moment and kind of close out our message by, I'm going to ask our elders to pray over the week, pray over the offerings that are coming in, pray over the work that's being done. And with this, we just want to set our hearts in that place of saying, okay, Lord, this is yours, and we want to open our hands up to you. So welcome, guys. You guys can pray.